Religion in the Greco-Roman world at the time of the Constantinian shift mostly comprised three main currents: the traditional religions of ancient Greece and Rome, the official Roman imperial cult, various mystery religions, such as the Eleusinian mysteries and the mystery cults of Cybele, Mithras, and the syncretized Isis. Early Christianity grew gradually in Rome and the Roman Empire from the 1st to 4th centuries, when it was legalized and, in its Nicene form, became the state church of the Roman Empire with the Edict of Thessalonica of 380. Hellenistic polytheistic traditions survived pockets of Greece throughout late antiquity. The Neoplatonic Academy was shut down by Justinian I in 529, a date sometimes taken to mark the end of classical antiquity. Before Constantine's Edict of Milan, the Romans tended towards syncretism, seeing the same gods under different names in different places of the empire, accommodating other Europeans such as the Hellenes, Germans, and Celts, and Semitic and other groups in the Middle East. Under Roman authority, the various national myths most similar to Rome were adopted by analogue into the overall Roman mythos, further cementing imperial control. Consequently, the Romans were generally tolerant and accommodating towards new deities and the religious experiences of other peoples who formed part of their wider empire. The rise of esoteric philosophy, the more philosophical outlook of the Hellenic parts of the Roman Empire, led to a renaissance of intellectual, religious thought around the start of the 2nd century. Writings pseudepigraphically attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, and discussing esoteric philosophy, magic, and alchemy, began to spread from Roman Egypt throughout the empire. While they are difficult to date with precision, these texts are likely to have been redacted between the 1st and 3rd centuries. Although such hermetica was generally written with the theological aim of spiritual improvement, each text had an anonymous, eclectic, and spontaneous origin, rather than being part of an organized movement. A more organized form of elatrist henotheistic panentheism emerged in parallel to Hermetism. In the 1st century BC, Cicero's friend Nigidius Figulus made an attempt to revive Pythagorean doctrines, an effort that was particularly successful under Apollonius of Tyana in the 1st century. Within a century, supernatural powers were being ascribed to Apollonius, and accounts of his life had similarities to those of Jesus. At least one major meeting place for followers of this Neo-Pythagoreanism was built in Rome itself, near Porta Maggiore, to a design similar to later Christian churches, though subterranean. In the 2nd century, Numenis of Apamea sought to fuse additional elements of Platonism into Neo-Pythagoreanism, a direction which Plotinus continued, forming Neoplatonism, a religion of theistic monism. Neoplatonism began to be adopted by prominent scholars such as the Christian theologian Origen and the anti-Christian Porphyry. During the rule of Gallienus, the imperial family themselves gave patronage to Plotinus, and encouraged his philosophical activities. Neoplatonism was further developed by Iamblichus, who believed that physical invocations would be able to produce soteriological results, and therefore added religious ritual to the philosophy. Emperor Julian tried to unify traditional Roman religion by mixing it with Iamblichus, a form of Neoplatonism. The influential Christian thinker, Augustine of Hippo, lived during this period, and his subsequent writings show heavy Neoplatonic influence. Eastern sun worship. At some time around the 1st century, the members of the Roman military began to adopt the mystery cult of Mithraism. This sun god-related cult arose from obscure non-Roman origins, and the first surviving reference dates to Plutarch's mention of a 67 BC observation of certain Mediterranean pirates practicing it. As the Roman legions gradually moved around, so too Mithraism spread throughout the Roman Empire. In the beginning it was mainly soldiers who followed its precepts, but it was also adopted by freedmen, slaves, and merchants, in the locations where the legions rested, particularly in frontier areas. Mithraism wasn't exclusive, it was possible and common to follow Mithraism and other cults simultaneously. It eventually became popular within Rome itself, gradually gaining members among the more aristocratic classes, and eventually counting some of the Roman senators as adherents. According to the Augustan history, even the Emperor Commodus was a member. Although, for reasons currently unknown, Mithraism completely excluded women. By the 3rd century it had gained a wide following. There are over 100 surviving remains of temples to Mithras, 8 in Rome itself, and 18 in Ostia, with Rome having over 300 associated Mithraic monuments. From the reign of Septimius Severus, other, less gender-specific, forms of sun worship also increased in popularity throughout the Roman Empire. Elagabalus used his authority to install Elgabal as the chief deity of the Roman pantheon, merging the god with the Roman sun gods to form Deus Sol Invictus, meaning God, the undefeated sun, and making him superior to Jupiter, and assigning either Astarte, Minerva, Urania, or some combination of the three, as Elgabal's wife. He rode roughshod over other elements of traditional religion, marrying a Vestal virgin, and moved the most sacred relics of Roman religion to a new temple dedicated exclusively to Elgabal. As much as the religiously conservative senators may have disapproved, the lavish annual public festivals held in Elgabal's honor found favor among the popular masses, partly on account of the festivals involving the wide distribution of food. Nearly half a century after Elagabalus, Aurelian came to power. He was a reformer, strengthening the position of the sun god as the main divinity of the Roman pantheon. He even built a brand new temple in Rome, dedicated to the deity. It's also thought likely that he may have been responsible for establishing the festival of the day of the birth of the unconquered sun, which was celebrated on December 25, the day when the sun appears to start rising again, 4 days after having previously reached its lowest point. Though the earliest surviving reference to the festival is in the chronography of 354, he followed the principle of one God, one empire. His intention was to give to all the peoples of the empire, civilian or soldiers, Easterners or Westerners, a single God they could believe in without betraying their own gods. Lactantius argued that Aurelian would have outlawed all the other gods if he had had enough time. But Aurelian only managed to hold on to the position of emperor for 5 years. Judaism and Christianity. Imperial tolerance only extended to religions that did not resist Roman authority and would respect Roman gods. Religions that were hostile to the state or any that claimed exclusive rights to religious beliefs and practice were not included, and some exclusive Eastern cults were persecuted. Jews were given special privileges owing to their dominance in economy, numbers and dispersal. But this tolerance was balanced unevenly on a thin veneer of Jewish submission. Tolerance of Judaism turned to persecution when collaboration was perceived as ending. See anti-Judaism in the pre-Christian Roman Empire. Intolerant sects could also persecute each other. Jewish sects like the early Christians were denounced by the Jewish establishment as dangerous provocateurs. According to some interpretations of the Council of Jamnia and the Birkat Haminam, the results included massacres of Christian communities and Jewish nationalist groups. The early Christian community was perceived at times to be an intrinsically destabilizing influence and threat to the peace of Rome, a religio illicita. The pagans who attributed the misfortunes of Rome and its wider empire to the rise of Christianity, and who could only see a restoration by a return to the old ways, were faced by the Christian Church that had set itself apart from that faith and was unwilling to dilute what it held to be the religion of the one true God. The same gods whom the Romans believed had protected and blessed their city and its wider empire during the many centuries they had been worshipped, were now demonized by the early Christian Church. Toleration and Constantine. After the initial conflicts between the state and the new emerging religion, Gallienus was the first emperor to issue an edict of toleration for all religious creeds including Christianity. According to Christian polemicists writing after his death, Constantine I was baptized on his deathbed, which would make him the first emperor to become a baptized Christian. Eusebius, a contemporary Christian historian, also praises him for having some pagan temples torn down. Nevertheless, whatever the imperial edicts said, the effects of policy under the Christian emperors down to Valentinian I and Valens were enough to cause a widespread trend to Christian conversion, but not enough to make paganism extinct. Actual persecution was sporadic and generally the result of local initiative. For example, Martin of Tours' destructions of holy sites in Gaul in the later 4th century. Official orders may have established an understanding that actual persecution would be tolerated, but in the 1st century of official Christianity did not generally organize it. By the Edict of Milan, Constantine continued the policy of toleration, which Galerius had established. His legislation against magic and private divination were driven out of a fear that others might gain power through those means. Nonetheless, this did not mean he or other Roman rulers disfavored divination. Instead, his belief in Roman divination is confirmed by legislation calling for the consultation of augurs after an amphitheatre had been struck by lightning. In the year 320, Constantine explicitly allowed public divination as a practice of state ceremony as well as public pagan practices to continue. Constantine also issued laws confirming the rights of flamens, priests and duumvirs. Beginning of persecution of paganism. The actions of Constantius II, who reigned from 337 till 361, marked the beginning of the era of formal persecution against paganism by the Christian Roman Empire, with the emanation of laws and edicts which punished pagan practices. From the 350s, new laws prescribed the death penalty for those who performed or attended pagan sacrifices. And for the worshipping of idols, temples were shut down, and the traditional altar of victory was removed from the Senate. There were also frequent episodes of ordinary Christians destroying, pillaging, desecrating, vandalizing many of the ancient pagan temples, tombs and monuments. The harsh imperial edicts had to face the vast following of paganism among the population, and the passive resistance of governors and magistrates. The anti-pagan legislation, beginning with Constantius, would in time have an unfavorable influence on the Middle Ages and, in some ways, become the basis of the Inquisition. Restoration and tolerance from Julian till Valens. Under the sole rule of Julian from 361 to 363, paganism saw an attempt at restoration, while from 363 till 375, under the reigns of Jovian, Valens and Valentinian I, it received a relative tolerance. Julian was a nephew of Constantine and received a Christian training, but the murder of his father, brother and 2 uncles in the aftermath of Constantine's death, he attributed to Constantius and by association to Christians in general. This antipathy was deepened when Constantius executed Julian's only remaining brother in 354 AD. After childhood, Julian was educated by Hellenists and was attracted to the teachings of Neoplatonists and the old religions. Julian's religious beliefs were syncretic and he was an initiate of at least 3 mystery religions. But Julian's religious open-mindedness did not extend to Christianity due to its belief that it had an exclusive perspective on religious truth. Seeing itself as the only true religion, Christianity was opposed to, and fundamentally incompatible with, the more inclusive syncretism of paganism. As emperor, Julian sought to turn the tide in the attempted suppression of non-Christian religions. As his first task, he sought to re-establish the old Roman pagan practice of incorporation of other religions. But now, instead of allowing different cults using different names for the same or similar deities, Julian's training in Christianity and imperial government influenced him to develop a single pagan religion. Thus, his ideas concerning the revival and organization of the old religion, shaping it into a coherent body of doctrine, ritual and liturgy with a hierarchy under the supervision of the emperor, was the hallmark of his reign. Julian organized elaborate rituals and attempted to set forth a clarified philosophy of Neoplatonism that might unite all pagans. Julian allowed religious freedom and avoided any form of actual compulsion. The Christian acknowledges that Julian did not compel Christians to offer sacrifice, nor did he allow the people to commit any active injustice towards the Christians or insult them. However, no Christian was allowed to teach or study the ancient classical authors, let them keep to Matthew and Luke, thus ending any chance they had of a professional career. He withdrew the privileges of the Christian clergy, bestowed on them by Constantine, and ordered them to make restitution. Those who had demolished temples during the reign of Constantine and Constantius were made to rebuild them, or to defray the expenses of their re-erection. Only pagans were allowed to teach in law, rhetoric, philosophy, or practice any form of state-sanctioned religious liturgy. Julian required those who had abandoned the deities to purify themselves before they were allowed the privilege of taking part in their worship once again. He was devoted to divination and allowed his subjects to freely practice this art. In general, the privileges and immunities given to the Christians were now replaced with those given to pagan philosophers and priests who subscribed to his Neoplatonic pagan religion. Jovian, Valentinian and Valens. After the death of Julian, Jovian seems to have instituted a policy of religious toleration which avoided the relative extremes of Constantius and Julian. Under Valentinian I and Valens, this period of religious toleration continued. Pagan writers praise both of these emperors for their liberal religious policies. Valentinian and Valens granted complete toleration for all cults at the beginning of their reign in 364. Valentinian, who ruled in the West, even allowed the performance of nocturnal sacrifices, which had been previously prohibited due to the attempt of some people to practice unlawful divination under the cover of the night. After the proconsul of Greece appealed to him, Valentinian also confirmed the rights and privileges of the pagan priests and confirmed the right of pagans to be the exclusive caretakers of their temples. Valens, who was ruling in the east, was an Arian and was too engaged with fighting against the Orthodox Christians to bother much with the pagans. In both the West and East, severe laws were once again passed prohibiting private divination. Due to the overzealousness of the populace to stop harmful divination, the haruspices and augurs began to be afraid to show themselves in public. This led the emperors to formally authorize the practice of official and lawful divination by law in 371. Despite the official policy, anti-pagan laws remained in force, and unofficial destruction of pagan holy sites was also tolerated. Renewal of persecution under Gratian. Upon the death of his father in the year 375, Gratian began his actual reign at the age of 16. 6 days after the death of Valentinian I, Gratian's half-brother, Valentinian II, who was only 4 years old, was also declared emperor. After the death of Valens, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, Gratian chose a Spaniard named Theodosius I to succeed his uncle. Gratian had been educated by Ausonius, who had praised his pupil for his tolerance. Upon the death of his father, Gratian came under the influence of Ambrose, who became his chief advisor. Under the influence of Ambrose, active steps to repress paganism were taken. The influence of Ambrose was a significant force that brought to an end a period of widespread, if unofficial, religious tolerance that had existed since the time of Julian. Gratian dealt paganism several blows in 382. In this year, Gratian appropriated the income of the pagan priests and Vestal virgins, confiscated the personal possessions of the priestly colleges and ordered the removal of the altar of victory. The colleges of pagan priests also lost all their privileges and immunities. Gratian declared that all of the pagan temples and shrines were to be confiscated by the government and that their revenues were to be joined to the property of the royal treasury. Pagan senators responded by sending an appeal to Gratian, reminding him that he was still the Pontifex Maximus and that it was his duty to see that the pagan rites were properly performed. They appealed to Gratian to restore the altar of victory and the rights and privileges of the Vestal Virgins and priestly colleges. Gratian, at the urging of Ambrose, did not grant an audience to the pagan senators. In response to being reminded by the pagans that he was still the head of the ancestral religion, Gratian renounced the title and office of Pontifex Maximus under the influence of Ambrose, declaring that it was unsuitable for a Christian to hold this office. Under Theodosius I, the Christian persecution of paganism under Theodosius I began in 381, after the first couple of years his reign in the Eastern Roman Empire. In the 380s, Theodosius I reiterated Constantius' ban on pagan sacrifice, prohibited haruspice on pain of death, pioneered the criminalization of magistrates who did not enforce anti-pagan laws, broke up some pagan associations and destroyed pagan temples. Between 389 to 391 he emanated the infamous Theodosian decrees, which established a practical ban on paganism. Visits to the temples were forbidden. Remaining pagan holidays abolished. The eternal fire in the Temple of Vesta and the Roman Forum extinguished. The Vestal Virgins disbanded. Auspices and witchcrafting punished. Theodosian refused to restore the altar of victory in the Senate House, as asked by pagan senators. In 392 he became emperor of the whole empire. From this moment till the end of his reign in 395, while pagans remained outspoken in their demands for toleration, he authorized or participated in the destruction of many temples, holy sites, images and objects of piety throughout the empire, and participated in actions by Christians against major pagan sites. He issued a comprehensive law that prohibited any pagan ritual even within the privacy of one's home, and was particularly oppressive of Manichaeans. Paganism was now prescribed, a religia illicita. He is likely to have suppressed the ancient Olympic Games, whose last record of celebration is from 393.